The sun had long since set on the crimson desert of Ardath IV, leaving the battlefield bathed in the eerie glow of distant stars. The air was thick with the acrid stench of plasma burns and the remnants of scorched earth, a silent testament to the brutality of the engagement that had occurred only hours before. The battle had been fierce. Human and Sirene warriors had clashed in a dance of death, leaving only blood, wreckage, and the ghosts of the fallen. Sergeant Edward Kane moved cautiously through the wasteland, his boots crunching over crystallized sand that had been transformed into glass by the deadly energy discharges. His rifle was slung over his shoulder, but his eyes were sharp, constantly scanning for danger. His suit's energy indicator flashed 43%, a grim reminder of how little time he had left if he wanted to make it back to friendly lines. The rest of his squad was gone. One by one, their bio-signatures had winked out during the chaotic retreat. Edward was alone now, guided only by his suit's compromised navigation system and his unwavering stubbornness. Despite the desolation around him, he refused to be defeated. He had survived this far. He wasn't about to die in this hellhole. A sudden groan pierced the silence, drawing Edward's attention. His hand instinctively gripped the rifle, scanning for threats, his every muscle tense. He crouched low, moving toward the source of the sound, his instincts as sharp as the combat veteran he was. Through the wreckage, he saw her. A Siren warrior, a member of the enemy forces, sprawled in the sand. Her once pristine green skin was marred by blood, and her combat suit, designed for both flexibility and defense, was torn, the black fabric charred and shredded. But it wasn't the state of her armor that caught Edward's eye. What froze him in place was the sight of her legs, or rather the lack of them. Below the knees, there was nothing but cauterized stumps, likely from a plasma mine. The gruesome injury left her motionless, save for the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Blood pooled around her body, the desert winds stirring it into grotesque patterns. She was dying. But even more striking was her face. Despite the agony, her features were strikingly beautiful, her ice-blue eyes bright even in her pain. As she slowly came to, her gaze met his, sharp and defiant despite her condition. Edward paused. His weapon was ready, his training kicking in, but something stopped him. He wasn't sure what it was. Perhaps it was the pride in her eyes, or maybe it was the way she looked at him, like he was some kind of challenge. "Kill me or leave, human," she spat, her voice tinged with contempt, but also something else. Fear? Edward's expression softened slightly, though his hand remained on his rifle. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said calmly, his voice betraying none of the emotion swirling inside him. She muttered something under her breath in her native tongue. Edward's translator worked overtime, rendering her words into a biting insult. He couldn't help but grin. "Quite a mouth on you for someone in your position," he remarked, lowering his rifle but keeping it at the ready. "Kill me or leave," she repeated, the words heavy with finality. Her anger was palpable, but so was her resignation. She wasn't going to beg for mercy. She was ready to die, to let the sands of this alien world be her grave. Edward studied her. Torn. The protocol screamed at him. She was the enemy. By rights, he should leave her to die. The Sirene had started this war, and they were the ones responsible for the bloodshed. But as he looked at her, stripped of her weapons, wounded and broken, he couldn't walk away. Not this time. He dropped to one knee beside her, checking the severity of her injuries. The blood loss was severe, and the makeshift tourniquet on her legs would not hold for much longer. Her survival, at best, was uncertain. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. He wasn't sure why he asked. It seemed the right thing to do. Perhaps it was a last act of humanity, in a place so devoid of it. She stared at him as though he had just asked a child's question. Ridiculous and nonsensical. "You're insane," she muttered. "I am Nirra Valor, warrior of the Third Blade cohort, and you cannot save me." Edward took a moment, his gaze steady before responding. "Well, Nirra Valor, it seems only polite if I'm about to save your life." Her eyes flashed with disbelief, a flicker of defiance still alive in her gaze. But for the first time, there was something else, something like curiosity. Despite the blood loss and pain, despite everything, she watched him like she was trying to figure out what kind of human would make such a decision. Without waiting for her response, Edward shrugged off his pack, pulling out a trauma kit. He moved with practiced precision, his military training kicking in even as he felt the weight of this decision. "Because I can," he replied simply, his tone matter-of-fact. "And because I'm starting to think this war is stupid enough without adding one more corpse to the pile." As he worked to stabilize her injuries, Edward couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this choice, would change everything. The night on Ardath IV was cold, far colder than Edward had anticipated. The wind swept across the barren landscape, carrying with it the gritty sting of sand and dust. Inside the ruins of the pre-war research station, Edward set up a makeshift camp. The emergency lighting flickered weakly, casting an eerie, blue-tinted glow over the walls covered in years of dust and decay. The abandoned station was eerily quiet, save for the soft hum of Edward's suit and the occasional rattle of shifting debris. Edward checked his suit's diagnostics again. Energy levels were still low, but there was enough to hold out for a while. He had set up thermal blankets and made sure the portable heaters were running to ward off the frigid night chill of the desert world. The station, once home to scientists and researchers, had long since been abandoned when the war began. All that remained were their forgotten experiments, gathering dust in the half-collapsed rooms. Now the place was just a shelter, a sanctuary, albeit temporary. Nirra was still unconscious, her body barely stable after the massive blood loss. But the emergency nanites he had injected into her veins were working, keeping the worst of the damage at bay. He had done all he could, for now. As the minutes turned into hours, Edward's thoughts were interrupted when Nirra shifted. Her ice-blue eyes fluttered open, blinking against the dim light. She let out a small groan as she tried to push herself up, her movements sluggish and pained. "Easy there, warrior princess," Edward said softly, moving to steady her. He kept his voice gentle, even as his hand hovered near his rifle, just in case. Nirra's gaze was sharp despite the grogginess in her expression. "What happened?" she rasped, her voice hoarse and weak. "You lost a lot of blood, but you're alive," Edward replied, helping her sit up against the cool metal of the station's floor. She looked around, her expression shifting from confusion to disdain. "I told you to leave me." "Yeah, well, I've never been good at following stupid orders," Edward said with a smirk, a trace of humor in his voice despite the seriousness of the situation. "Especially when they come from someone who wants to die." Nirra glared at him, but there was something else in her eyes now. Reluctance, maybe even gratitude, though she wouldn't admit it. "You are foolish." Edward chuckled softly, giving her some space. "I get that a lot." She glanced at him sideways, her eyes narrowing. You are different. We believed humans were savage creatures, but you show mercy, kindness." Her voice was tinged with something deeper now. Curiosity, perhaps. "I guess we're not all bad," Edward replied, though he could see she was still struggling with the idea. "Not every one of us is out here for conquest, Nirra." She tilted her head slightly, her ice-blue eyes still sizing him up. There was something about the way she studied him that caught his attention. Something beyond the exhaustion and pain. "You speak as though you know us," Nirra murmured, as if contemplating something. "How could you, when you have only seen the worst of us?" Edward shrugged, settling down a few feet away, his eyes never leaving her. "Maybe I just want to believe there's more to a person than what you see on the battlefield." Nirra's lips curled into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Maybe you're foolish enough to believe that." She paused. "But I have seen your people. You fight like animals." And yet, she looked at him, her gaze softening ever so slightly. "You fight for each other, even the worst of you." Edward shifted uneasily at the compliment, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to being praised by an enemy soldier, let alone one who had tried to kill him only hours before. "Are you saying that I'm not like the others?" he asked, genuinely curious. She hesitated for a moment before answering, her voice barely a whisper. "Not all humans are the same. But you are different." A long silence followed, broken only by the occasional hum of their suits and the eerie silence that enveloped the ruined station. Edward could feel the weight of the conversation settling between them, the slow-burning realization that they were becoming something more than just enemies. He wasn't sure what it was exactly. Maybe it was the shared struggle, or maybe it was the silence of mutual understanding. But he felt it. "You're lucky to be alive," Nirra said, her tone firm again as she tested her newly enhanced legs, adjusting to the weight of the prosthetics. "Maybe I just don't know when to die," Edward said with a grin, standing up to check the perimeter. He felt the need to keep moving, to keep doing something, even though they were technically safe for the moment. "Besides, you're lucky too." Nirra looked at him sharply, her eyebrows arched in confusion. "How so?" Edward gestured to her new cybernetic legs with a nod of approval. "I got to be the one to save you." His tone was matter-of-fact, but there was something else in his eyes, something that wasn't lost on Nirra. She didn't respond immediately, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes. She had just received a second chance, not just at life, but at purpose. Her pride had been shattered, her body broken, but there was a spark of something else in her now, something she couldn't ignore. "You're right," Nirra said finally, her voice low but steady. "I was not prepared to be saved," when Edward's smile faded, replaced by something more serious. "Well, you're stuck with me now." For a moment, they just stared at each other. Two warriors who had been enemies, now bound together by a shared experience neither of them could have anticipated. The night stretched on, and the distant sounds of explosions and gunfire continued, a constant reminder of the war raging beyond the ruins. But inside, in this moment of fragile peace, there was something else. Something between Edward and Nirra that neither of them fully understood. The night in the ruins had stretched on, and the frigid desert air continued to howl around the abandoned research station, carrying with it the echoes of a distant war. Yet, inside the station's crumbling walls, the tension between two sworn enemies simmered quietly. Edward and Nirra had established an uneasy truce, an alliance born out of necessity, but also the faintest flicker of understanding. Edward sat cross-legged by a small campfire he had managed to spark in the station's corner, his rifle resting against the wall. He hadn't yet had a moment to process everything, the chaos of the battle, the decision to save Nirra, and now the silent space between them that was beginning to feel anything but hostile. Nirra, though still recovering from her grievous injuries, was testing the cybernetic enhancements on her legs. She stood with a slight grimace on her face, her movements stiff but improving with each passing moment. The military-grade prosthetics had given her the ability to walk again, but walking felt foreign now, a stark contrast to the grace and power she had once exhibited on the battlefield. "I'm not used to this," she said, her voice a mixture of awe and frustration as she took another step. Her eyes flickered to Edward, who was watching her closely. "You'll get the hang of it," Edward replied, offering a small smile. There was a quiet pride in his voice. Despite their differences, he had helped bring her back, something he never expected to do for an enemy, let alone a high-ranking Sirene warrior. The feeling of satisfaction was new to him. He wasn't sure if it was the act of saving her or something deeper, the bond that was beginning to form between them. Nirra let out a huff, more of frustration than fatigue. "I was a warrior," she said quietly, not meeting his gaze. "Now I'm a cripple." Edward shook his head. "You're not crippled, Nirra. You just need to adapt. My people do it all the time." She looked at him, her expression sharp. "Your people use technology to survive. And you're lucky to have it," he said, crossing his arms. "There's nothing wrong with using what you've got to stay alive." Her ice-blue eyes narrowed as she took another step, still testing her new legs. Her pride was a strong force inside her, a constant companion. The Sirene people were proud, unbending, and in their eyes, accepting anything less than perfection, especially augmentation, was a sign of weakness. The augmentation he had helped her receive had given her the power to walk again, but it was something she had fought for her entire life. "I don't like it," she said bluntly, still not meeting his eyes. "To us, natural perfection is everything. These—" she motioned to her new legs. "They are a disgrace." Edward chuckled softly, moving to her side and offering her a canteen of water. "Well, I'm glad you think so, but in my opinion, it's about survival, adaptation. We adapt to the world around us." He stepped back, checking the perimeter once more before returning his gaze to her. "And honestly, it doesn't make you any less of a warrior. You're still a Sirene warrior, no matter what." There was a flicker of something unspoken in her eyes at the mention of her former identity. The warrior's pride was still there, buried beneath the surface of her vulnerability and the conflict of accepting the help of her enemy. She took a drink from the canteen he offered, her lips curving into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "You are foolish, human," she said softly. "But you are also strange. I expected you to be something else." Her eyes briefly glanced up, a hint of something she hadn't fully realized yet. The beginnings of respect. "Yeah," Edward said, a lopsided grin appearing on his face. "I get that a lot." Nirra studied him for a long moment. Despite the pain, despite the war, despite everything, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something different about him. Something beyond the brutality that both of their species had assumed defined the other. "Your people are nothing like we were told," Nirra said finally, her voice softer, almost contemplative. Edward sat down, his elbows resting on his knees. He didn't need to ask her to elaborate. He could feel the shift in the air. "I told you, we're not all bad." Nirra shook her head slightly, as if shaking off some old thought. "I still don't understand you. You're kind. I have seen your kind fight in bloodlust, murder in cold blood." She paused, almost as if reconsidering. "But you saved me." Edward's gaze softened. "Maybe I just wanted to do something different, something that mattered." The tension in the room seemed to shift. The war and everything it represented felt distant here, in the crumbling ruins of a long-abandoned research station, where two enemies had found themselves not just surviving, but sharing the same space. The silence stretched out before them, filled only with the soft hum of Edward's suit and the occasional rattle of the station settling around them. but neither of them felt the need to break it. There was something intimate in that silence, something that transcended the barriers of war, hatred, and pride. The moment was interrupted when Edward's suit sensors began to beep softly, alerting him to movement outside. He froze, instinctively reaching for his rifle, though the sound of the seismic tremor was unmistakable. Nirra stiffened beside him. "Artillery?" she asked, already reaching for a weapon she didn't have. Edward checked the tactical display on his wrist. No seismic activity. But something's wrong. Another tremor shook the ground, stronger this time, sending loose debris falling from the ceiling. Both of them tensed, their combat instincts kicking in. "We need to move deeper," Edward said, grabbing their supplies quickly. The outer chambers of the research station were exposed to whatever was causing these tremors. Nirra nodded in agreement, her newly enhanced legs helping her move more swiftly now, though there was still a slight staggering to her steps. Edward moved to assist her, but she waved him off. "I'm fine. I'll manage." Edward gave her a sideways glance, offering a slight smile despite the dire situation. "Good to know, but I'm still going to carry you if it comes to that." Her expression softened, but only just. "You have a very odd sense of honor, Edward Kane." "Yeah, I've been told." He turned to lead the way, scanning the shadows ahead of them. "But I'm sticking to it, even if it gets me killed." The tremor had shaken the entire station, but it wasn't just the seismic rumbling that had set Edward's senses on edge. The station, once a marvel of alien research, was now a death trap, its jagged ruins and decaying structure threatening to collapse at any moment. Every footstep they took was measured, careful, as they navigated deeper into the ancient corridors. Nirra was walking better now, her movements smoother, though still not entirely natural. She had come a long way from the warrior who had been lying on the battlefield, near death. Edward couldn't help but glance at her now and then, part of him still processing the strange connection forming between them. The fact that they were both survivors of a war that had torn their worlds apart seemed almost impossible. They reached a room that appeared to be some sort of medical bay, preserved from the ravages of time by the station's automated systems. Its white surfaces gleamed faintly under the soft light of Edward's suit, and the room smelled faintly of antiseptic. It was like stepping into a relic of a time long past. Nirra moved to a nearby diagnostic bed, looking it over with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. "Looks like we've stumbled into a med bay," Edward said, his tone lighter than he felt. "If we're lucky, maybe there's something here that can help us fix this whole mess." Nirra didn't answer immediately. Instead, she examined the equipment with a cautious eye. "I'd say we're about to find out." Edward moved to the central console, examining the diagnostic system, trying to make sense of the various pieces of alien technology that lay in front of him. His suit's sensors beeped as he worked, noting the presence of advanced cybernetic systems hidden beneath layers of dust. "This place hasn't been touched in years," he muttered, "but it's still functional." He glanced at Nirra. Her eyes had settled on him as he worked, the faintest hint of trust beginning to replace the wariness that had been in her gaze since they first met. There was something calming about this place, despite the impending chaos outside. He didn't feel the need to constantly be on guard, and maybe, just maybe, Nirra didn't either. As he fiddled with his control panel, he noticed Nirra testing her new prosthetic legs again. This time, her movements were less tentative, more assured. She had gained control over them, and the realization made Edward smile. She had been broken, both physically and mentally, but she was rebuilding herself, just as they were rebuilding their fractured world. Nirra caught him looking at her and met his gaze. Her eyes flickered with an unreadable expression. "You think I'll be able to fight again?" Edward was silent for a long moment, then nodded. I think you can do more than just fight, Nirra. I think you can lead." Nirra's face softened slightly, though she still didn't speak. Edward turned back to the medical console, pulling up data on the cybernetic prosthetic systems. "If we can access these systems, I could get you fully outfitted. Fully restored, even better than before." Her gaze remained intense, but there was a flash of something in her eyes, something vulnerable, something she rarely showed. She glanced down at her newly acquired legs, then back at him. "What will you ask of me in return?" Edward paused. He didn't answer immediately. What was he supposed to say? That he didn't expect anything in return? That saving her had been a matter of principle and not some calculated move for future leverage? But Nirra's expression didn't change. She was still the warrior she had been before, proud, unyielding, but now curious, vulnerable. A strange thought crossed Edward's mind. Maybe they weren't so different after all. "I'm not asking for anything," Edward said softly, his voice steady but full of meaning. "I just want to get you back on your feet." Nirra studied him, and for the first time, he saw something soften in her. Not just trust, but a glimpse of something deeper. "Maybe you should stop saving me then. You might just save yourself." Before Edward could reply, the sound of footsteps echoed through the narrow corridors. His heart skipped a beat. The sudden dread that had been gnawing at him ever since they entered the station rose to the surface. The danger was closing in on them. "They found us," Edward whispered, grabbing his rifle and scanning the area. Nirra quickly moved to the nearest weapon locker, her new legs humming softly with power as she effortlessly retrieved a plasma rifle. Her eyes glowed with determination as she turned to him. "I can handle this." "No," Edward said firmly, though a part of him admired her bravery. "We handle this together." The footsteps grew louder, and the tension in the room spiked. Both squads, human and Sirene, were closing in on them. The enemy wasn't far away. They needed to decide what to do now. Fight? Or try to escape? Nirra's gaze was unwavering as she raised her weapon. "I don't run," she said, the words carrying the weight of someone who had lived her life on the edge of battle. Edward gave her a small, grim smile. "Me neither." As both of them prepared for what was about to unfold, gunfire and the sound of artillery fire could be heard in the distance. They weren't just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting for a future. A future that could change the course of this war and, potentially, the galaxy. The next few minutes would decide it all. Would they escape? Or would they make their last stand right here? The tension in the small medical bay was almost suffocating. Every minute that passed felt like it brought them closer to the end of their fragile sanctuary. The sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, grew closer, and Edward's mind raced. He checked his weapon once more, feeling the weight of the situation settle heavily on his shoulders. The human and Sirene forces were closing in, and it wasn't just the war they were fighting anymore. It was the future of both their species. Nirra stood beside him, her newly enhanced legs steady beneath her. There was a determination in her stance now, a fire that burned beneath her skin, and Edward couldn't help but feel a flicker of admiration. He had saved her life. But in this moment, it was clear she was no longer the broken warrior he had found on the battlefield. She had become something more. "We don't have much time," Edward said, his voice low but firm. "They'll be here soon." Nirra nodded, her eyes narrowing in the direction of the approaching squads. "Then we fight. Together." Edward studied her for a moment, his heart racing. The two of them had come a long way from their first encounter. Their enemy alliance had transformed into something neither of them could deny. They had crossed the line of what was possible, of what was expected between enemies. "Together," he repeated, his voice a little quieter this time. They were no longer just two soldiers fighting to survive. They had become something else entirely, a new force, united in a way that transcended their pasts, their species, and even the war itself. The door to the medical bay burst open, and the sound of heavy boots echoed through the room. Edward immediately raised his weapon, but Nirra was faster. The plasma rifle she had retrieved from the emergency locker hissed to life, its energy pulse cutting through the air with deadly precision. She fired at the doorway, sending the first soldier crashing to the floor. But there were more. Too many. Edward rushed to her side, firing at the advancing enemy with surgical precision. The neural link between him and Nirra had become stronger now, their shared awareness making every move more synchronized. It was as if they were moving as one. A perfect fusion of human strategy and Sirene combat training. "This is insane," Edward muttered, ducking behind a console as another barrage of blaster fire whizzed past them. Nirra grinned, her lips curling into a feral smile as she fired again, taking down another soldier. Not insane, effective. They moved as if they were in perfect rhythm, never having to speak the same thought. Each shift, each tactical move was mirrored by the other. It was almost as if their neural link was a living weapon, one that made them unstoppable. The battle raged on, but the odds didn't seem as insurmountable now. Together, they were a force, two enemies, fighting as one for something greater than survival. It wasn't just about defeating the enemy anymore. It was about proving that unity could change everything. Edward had always been a soldier, a fighter who had never questioned orders. But in that moment, with Nirra beside him, he realized something. This fight was for more than just the war. It was for the future, for the possibility that two worlds could find common ground, even in the most unimaginable of circumstances. The fighting intensified, but Edward's resolve only grew stronger. He could feel Nirra's emotions through their link. Fury, yes, but also something deeper. Determination. Hope. Then, there was a shift. The last of the enemy soldiers fell, leaving the room in a hushed silence. Edward lowered his rifle, breath heavy in his chest. His mind was still racing, but there was a calmness that had settled over him. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. Nirra stood beside him, her breathing just as heavy. She wiped the sweat from her brow, her icy blue eyes meeting his. "That's how we do it, huh?" Edward said, offering her a grin. She didn't smile back, but there was something in her gaze, a flicker of understanding. It is now. Just as the room fell silent, a transmission came through on Edward's communicator. His heart skipped a beat as the voice of Captain Reynolds came through, static crackling in the background. "Sergeant Kane, Nirra Valor, we've been monitoring the situation. The peace talks have begun, but there's been a shift. The Council wants to speak with you both. They're open to discussing your—" Reynolds's voice cut off briefly, before returning. "Your hybrid child. Your unity might just be the key to ending this war." Nirra's gaze flickered to Edward, a quiet shock in her eyes. "The Council wants peace?" Edward took a deep breath. He was still processing what had just happened. The battle, the destruction, the undeniable truth that things were changing. It looks like we're not just fighting for survival anymore. We're fighting for something bigger. "Then let's show them what we can do," Nirra said, her voice low and determined. As the human and Sirene forces prepare for the final confrontation, Edward and Nirra have one last hurdle to cross. The peace talks. Will they be able to change the course of the war? Or will their alliance be torn apart by those who refuse to accept the future they represent? The stakes have never been higher, and the final test of their bond both as warriors and as something much more, looms on the horizon.